first of the beginnings of LGBTQ rights events involved ID checks. So I want to take a poll. Has anyone here ever heard of the riot at Cooper's Donuts? I hadn't either. It was actually the first event that historians have found and see as kind of the beginning of the LGBTQ rights movement. In May of 1959, at Cooper's Donuts in Los Angeles, police came in to make arrests. Now, Cooper's was a hangout spot for trans and genderqueer folks in particular, and the police came into the restaurant to check IDs, as was the norm. At this time, the folks decided to fight back, and they threw whatever they could find at the police. Donuts, coffee, trash. The pushback spilled out into the streets in front of Cooper's and turned into an uprising, with people setting fires, standing on cars. And Cooper's Donuts may in fact have been the first time that a group of LGBTQ folks fought back against police harassment and unjust laws. And it was led by transgender and gender non-conforming people in 1959. Later on the other side of the country, on April 25th, 1965, the Dewey sit-in happened in Philadelphia. Another raise of hands. Anybody heard of Dewey's sit-in before? Dewey's was a popular spot for LGBTQ African American folks. The owners of Dewey's began to kick young people out because they were wearing nonconformist clothing, which was basically their way of kicking out queer folks. So on April 25th, more than 150 youth purposely dressed in nonconformist clothing and went to Dewey's in protest, and they were turned away. 3 teenagers refused to leave and were arrested. And in the weeks that followed, the Philadelphia African American LGBTQ community set up a picket line outside Dewey's. And in May, another sit-in was organized. This time there were no arrests, and Dewey's backed off. They stopped denying service to these young people. And this moment at Dewey's lunch counter is another example of the beginnings of the movement, of people starting to take a stand against injustice. That these folks were a diverse and radical group. They included all, including people of color. All, like in the Rainbow Covenant. And the third event, I'm going to poll again. The third event happened in San Francisco in the summer of 1966. And it was known as the Compton's Cafeteria Riot. Anybody know of that one? Gaining a little bit of knowledge. In 1966, the Tenderloin area of San Francisco was known as a neighborhood where transgender individuals, adults, and youth called home. And Compton's was an all-night restaurant in that area that became a hangout spot for transgender individuals. And around that same time, street-based trans youth were also organizing in a group called Vanguard, and were meeting at Compton's, and picketed Compton's in July for kicking them out of that same space. And in August 1966, police, like our other stories, police entered Compton's to check IDs and arrest people for masquerading. But as in the other events, restaurant customers fought back. One of the women started it by throwing coffee at the police, and others in the restaurant threw cups, plates, and furniture, broke windows. The next day, trans people and their allies picketed outside, and the people picketing were of all genders, all classes, all races. This riot served as a turning point in the trans movement and led to new transgender social services in the area, including the availability of ID cards. It illustrates again both the power of these events and the inclusive nature of these events. Not just gay and lesbian folks, but transgender individuals and allies, street youth, people of all classes and races, stepping up together against injustice. I imagine God being proud with these folks throughout history who held strong to their place in that Rainbow Covenant, that covenant with all. Now finally, there's of course Stonewall, perhaps the best known event. Who knows about Stonewall? I was expecting that. I'd like to place Stonewall alongside these other events, not to lessen its importance, but to add power to it, as a part of this powerful witness of folks who have claimed to be a part of God's all and fought back when people told them they weren't. The Stonewall Inn was known as the gay bar in New York City. It had a mix of patrons. They ranged between their upper teens and early 30s and were a relatively even mix of white, black, and Hispanic folks. It was one of the few gay bars that allowed dancing, believe it or not, and had a smaller room in the back where gender non-conforming folks would often hang out. And street-based youth would often try to get in the front, and many of them slept in the park nearby, so they would hang out in the front to try to get in if they could. And on June 28th, 1969, the day most of you have heard of, it looks like, 6 police attempted to raid Stonewall Inn and arrest people for simply being themselves, for being part of that all. While the police held customers inside, protesters outside began to fight back. Sylvia Rivera, a Latina street-based transgender youth, was one of the first people to fight back outside. And in fact, it was the folks outside who started the riot, many of whom were homeless LGBTQ youth and transgender persons who had a harder time getting inside the bar, so congregated outside. People threw pennies, 4 coppers. People threw pennies and started fires and tried to open the front door while 6 police held people inside. The situation escalated, and 5 full buses of police and riot gear showed up. The people outside marched around the neighborhood to escape the police, kind of doing circles, while the police destroyed much of the Stonewall Inn itself. And in response to this uprising, neighborhood organizers printed overnight about 5,000 leaflets, and the bar reopened soon after. Upon reopening, groups gathered outside the bar to protest. More of the well-off gay folks joined in, along with members of the Black Panthers and the anti-war movement. Another riot broke out, and there were more beatings, blood, and this time tear gas. The movement had officially kicked in. And 1 year later, the first Pride Parade happened there in New York City. It was a risky parade. The first time, think about it, this is the time when cops are arresting folks for being out. This is the first time people had walked the streets of New York and publicly proclaimed, "I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm queer, I'm transgender," held signs that said this, in the face of unjust laws and discrimination. It was a bold stand against injustice. That boldness is the roots of our Pride Parade today. So Stonewall, combined with Cooper's, with Dewey's, with Compton's, illustrates the great diversity, the great all that took part in the beginnings of the LGBTQ rights movement. This all is the same all that's involved in that covenant with all, that rainbow covenant. And these folks are, and we are, the all in that covenant. That traces all the way back to the time of Nolan. It is radically inclusive. And at Broadway, we insist that that must mean it is anti-racist, too. This all is what we celebrate today for Pride. For God celebrates with us. Amen? Amen? Amen. This all is what we need to reclaim when Pride celebrations don't always live up to it. Don't you see the rainbows all around us reminding us of that? But Pride also comes with a challenge. And I want to leave you with this challenge today. Jesus was fond of challenges too, believe it or not. Our gospel text today issues a challenge to saltiness. A challenge that seems appropriate for Pride as well. Jesus tells us that we are the salt of the earth and we can't lose our flavor. That means we're at risk for losing our flavor, becoming bland, becoming like bland salt, ineffective. I would venture to say Pride is at risk, and I think has indeed at times lost its original bold, radical flavor. Salt brings out the flavor in foods. It brings out richness, complexity, gives that oomph. I love salt. I will eat it by spoonful. It adds spice to life. Being salty is about bringing the spice. Jesus' call to be the salt of the earth is a call to stand against injustice, just like folks throughout the history of Pride. There is surely injustice to stand against today, am I right? In fact, some of this very same injustices and mistreatment of street-based people, of gender non-conforming people, of people of color. On this Pride, we can follow these roots, follow our ancestors in this journey, and add some spice, bring the oomph. Not settling for less than the all that we know God calls us to. We've got to step up to the plate and bring the salt. That's really cheesy, but it gets it. You've got to step up to the plate and bring the salt. The trans folks at Cooper's Donuts brought the salt. The African American LGBTQ folks at Dewey's brought the salt. The street-based people at Compton's Cafeteria brought the salt. The lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people at Stonewall brought the salt. Sylvia Rivera brought the salt. Audrey Milk brought the salt. Act Up brought the salt. Audrey Ward brought the salt. Jesus, in fact, brought the salt. We've got to have pride and bring the salt today. And the days after Pride, too. Let's not rest until all are celebrated. All of us in the room and all of us out there. The all that God celebrates too in that rainbow covenant. And that includes you. May it be so with God's help. Amen. Amen.